How do we make sense of boards? How do they direct companies in success and stay away from failure? How do we really understand boards? That's the topic I want to talk to you about very briefly. When boards fail, it actually is a human failure. And I want to share with you some examples of boards that I've been working with in my practice as a board consultant over the last year or so. A first-time non-executive director becomes chair and actually takes on a huge role, a big role, as the chair, basically telling the CEO what to do. Within a year, there's a huge clash between the chair and the CEO. The other non-executive directors cannot restrain the chair, and within a year, it's complete breakdown of all the governance relationships. It's publicly displayed, and the company is in really bad shape. The second example, the chair of a hospital, very senior, very experienced. At some point, he has taken in his mind that actually there's a financial crisis going on inside the hospital. And he starts to challenge everyone, not just the executives, but everybody in the hospital itself to figure out what's happening. Everybody tells him, actually, there's no crisis, we adapt and we do this constantly. But he cannot be brought to any sensible idea. He's unsettling everyone inside the hospital, inside the executive group, and his other non-executive directors, who freeze. They don't intervene. It lasts for 6 or 7 months, and then the chair has to resign. Everybody has come to some sort of resistance and forces him to leave. The hospital is actually still in shape. Third example, a strong, very dominant CEO bullying everybody inside the company and gets frustrated by his non-executive directors in the boardroom because they don't listen to him. They raise the wrong questions. They don't understand the business. And he wants to bully them too. And he is doing so. And the non-executive directors cave in. They shut up. They will not challenge him anymore. They become afraid. And for 2 years, they actually don't do anything. The board meetings become meaningless. Nothing is really happening until a tiny incident occurs, and suddenly they dismiss the CEO, leaving the company without its strong leader. What has happened here? These are human beings in a very complex setting, trying to make sense of what they're supposed to be doing, and it's not always working as it should. We don't know what actually is happening within boardrooms. When as academics we look at it, we look at the inputs, what goes into boards, what sort of people sit in boardrooms, their experience, their gender, where they come from. And we see the outside, what comes out of the company, the output, the company performance, and we try to correlate the two, but actually that doesn't explain what happens in boardrooms. It's a black box for those who sit on the outside. In our consultancy practice, we can sit on the inside and see what is happening, and we try to make sense of it. We try to find explanations for the behavior that we see in boards. Boards are complex social systems. They are not just determined by the system, by the regulations, the expectations of lawmakers, corporate governance codes, by incentives that investors like to see. There's much more going on. There's group dynamics between executives and non-executives, amongst non-executive directors. And thirdly, there are personal capabilities, qualities and weaknesses that are contributed to the boardroom. Individual drives, experiences, virtues, all of that. If you want to make sense of how a board actually is functioning, you have to look at all these three and look at the board as a very complex interaction between non-executive directors and executive directors. Now, explaining behavior is a tricky thing because we can find explanations at many levels. If we look just 1 second back, the only level we can see is a sort of neurobiological, what neurons fired, what hormones sloshed through the brain, and that triggered the behavior. But somewhat later on, or earlier in time, what went on psychologically in the person who behaved in the way that he behaved? How can we explain that? What story did the person tell himself, explaining his own life and his role and the way that he should behave in certain contexts? Is it actually designed and created all by genetics? Is there anything that we can choose ourselves, or are the genes actually telling us who we will turn out to be in whatever context we'll operate? Or is it culture? Is it the social environments, the cultural background that we developed ourselves from and which we found ourselves in our business environment? Is that actually telling us what to do, and is that driving us what to do? And even if we go much further back in time, are the drives not actually evolutionary? Is that not explaining the typical drives, the typical behaviors that we display as human beings? In reality, all of these explanations probably are true, but how to make sense of that? We've come up with a perspective that has been designed not so much for the board space, but as a philosophical direction, the phenomenology, with some old grey men you see here on the screen, who actually try to figure out what the human experience in the real world is actually all about. Husserl wrote about to reduce the human experience and do away with all the storytelling about this, the analysis about it, but what is the core, the immanent of the experience? Heidegger explained that experience of being a person is always an experience of being in the world. You can't strip the world out of your own personal experience. You're always somewhere in some context that defines you, that determines what you do. Merleau-Ponty then took it to actually a more bodily effect. All of those experiences are starting with bodily perception. Our body, with all its sentiments, actually perceives the reality, and we respond to this. And if we want to make sense of that, actually Hans Gadamer explained to us, this is not a type of analysis, this is about verstehen. It's a much more intuitive linking between the various elements of relevance for what we are doing. That exercise creates a picture of what the human experience in every particular context actually is. It is a dense experience based on a net of associations, memories, assumptions, emotions, intuitions, and they're all activated by what we perceive. And once we perceive something, it is already immediately encompassed by a vast richness of experience that we already know before we actually start to think about this. We translate that into stories, into narratives, and some of that experience actually is unconscious. We don't know that we experience this. We can't talk about this. We would not be able to find the right words for it. Those experiences, the perceptions that we derive from them, the stories that we develop, the unconscious elements of that, all of that determines our behavior in any specific context in which we find ourselves. In the boardroom, this understanding is relevant, for example, for the roles that people play as non-executives in a boardroom and as executives in a boardroom, and how they understand and perceive their own role, but also the roles of others in that board context. It is also relevant for how people understand and perceive the dynamics between the people who sit around the board table. What their own position in that dynamic actually is, how they can and should and would be able to contribute. All of that is defined by that rich human experience that we already have even before we enter the boardroom. Now, if you look at the board space, there are some essentials that determine vast areas of the human experience in the boardroom. First of all, the board meets episodically. It isn't constantly involved in running the business. It meets perhaps 8 to 10 times a year. Some groups individually in commissions and committees, etc., meet in between, but it's always episodic. That means that there is little scope for joint reflection, joint coordination between the non-executives. And as a result, we see typically there's a tendency to keep the peace, to not say what could be said or should be said, to keep it balanced. The unsaid in the boardroom is rich, and people actually are aware of the unsaid but still don't say it. Secondly, there is a negative risk-reward element for non-executive directors. When there is an upside, the company is doing well, that typically is seen as the success of the executive directors, and they get paid for it. But non-executives do share in the downside risk. When the company goes wrong, there's a failure, they are publicly scrutinized too, and perhaps even in courts with personal liability. So they have the downside risk, but very little, if anything, of the upside risk. Secondly, the outside world more and more assumes that non-executive directors, the board, is fully in control and therefore fully responsible. How to make sense of that responsibility when you only meet 8 times a year and you're not actually running the company. Thirdly, there's a very complex relationship between non-executives and executives. The non-executives actually know much less, have much less information and understanding of the company and its markets, its products, its services, the way it can and should operate. Executives have the upper hand there. Nonetheless, at the same time, there's a formal hierarchy between non-executives and executive directors. The non-executives appoint and reappoint, dismiss, assess, and remunerate, reward the executive directors. So the hierarchy is ambivalent. Now, all of that explains some of the examples that I mentioned at the start. The board space is actually one of uncertainty. where non-exec directors do not know precisely what actually is happening, what course to take, what direction to take that should be successful, how to respond to something immediate or to some long-term threat. Who would know if you're in that role? And that creates anxiety because particularly the outside world expects you to take full responsibility. You have no control, relatively little knowledge, but yet you are responsible. How do board members deal with that anxiety? How do they contain this uncertainty? Well, let's go back to the examples. The chairman who puts himself in full control, because of its lack of experience, he takes on a full role, fully in control, 4 days a week working inside the company to be able to actually feel that you're in control and know what you're doing. Or the second chairman who propels himself into action, starts to run around the company, upsetting and unsettling everybody in its neighborhood. And the other non-executive directors who, seeing this, actually freeze. They don't know what to do. They don't contain or restrain the chairman in these roles, and they wait for an accident to happen and only then they intervene. Same thing with the ambivalent hierarchical relations between non-executives and executives. How to deal with that? Then go back to the frustrated dominant CEO who tries to bully and dominate the board but fails, perhaps in the long term. Non-executive directors forced by this bullying behavior to not being completely probing and challenging to the CEO, they stay silent for 2 years, and only then, after a small mistake, they fire him and get rid of the problem. That is what drives the human experience in the boardroom. Now, how to deal with this? There's not one set of single answers. What we find in our boardroom practice and what we think about and try to substantiate and validate academically is there are at least 5 elements crucial for effective board practices. First of all, the board should always maintain some sort of reflective space, a space in which the verstehen actually is much more important than the analysis and the calculations. The intuitions and emotions actually count in that space, and they are relating to the persons but also to the roles that they think they are playing. Humility, not assuming that you know everything because you know something, and that your opinion actually should also be the opinion of anybody else. Listening, have empathy to others, also with their concerns. Listen deeply. Developing trust. It's easily said than done. It walks away quickly and it's very hard to restore. We know all of that. And fourthly, paresia, an old Greek notion of having the courage to speak the truth when it should be said and when it potentially may have consequences for yourself when you say it. Only then we can speak about courage. Finally, there's another element that is pretty relevant in any context, human context, but certainly also in the boardroom. Practical wisdom, or the old Greek word phronesis. Being sensitive to the context. What is needed today here may be something different from what was needed last week or 2 years ago in a similar but slightly different context. Boards need to train and develop themselves playing with these tools, with these virtues, so to say. And boards who actually do that do generate effective board dynamics.